So yes, Scott, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me this afternoon. The 2020 marketing technology landscape, of course, for those who don't know, is the authoritative list of martech vendors from ad tech to social to data and everything in between. 8,000 vendors in it this year, which is staggering by the sounds of it. Generally speaking, of course, this was done in April, so pre everything that happened with COVID, but just sum up, if you could, what the key takeaways were from this year's edition, and what, if anything, surprised you this year.
Hmm. Yeah, so I think the key takeaway is that marketing technology is an incredibly large and diverse field. That landscape has been growing every year since 2011 when I first started working on it. And even from 2019 to 2020, we added nearly 1,000, new solutions to that map. And it's always challenging because, like we're so used to consolidation, within markets. And the truth is there is consolidation happening in MarTech, but for every companies that you hear about consolidating up into these larger firms, there are all these new startups that end up getting created as well too. And I think part of what we just recognize is the world of software has changed. It is just so easy for people to leverage, these cloud platforms like AWS or Google Cloud or Azure, and all these open source technologies and tools that if you have a software idea, like getting it off the ground and getting it out into the market is there's almost no barriers to entry.
Hmm. I mean, the interesting thing from my side, obviously, data was up 25% and management was up 15%. It seems kind of logical that marketers have all this data and data sources, as you mentioned, the cloud platforms as well, to enable that. They need to get these insights, but they've got too many jobs as it is. That needs a little bit more expertise. So looking at the sort of the middlemen with regards to that, and that's a real opportunity that you've seen over the past couple of years, I presume.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think one of the things you're seeing too is like when this landscape started growing, initially all of these different tools were very disconnected from each other, which made it very challenging for marketers to get these things to work together. But what we've been seeing in the industry over these past few years is a greater emphasis on integration within that vendor community themselves, whether it's through, major platforms like, Salesforce or Adobe or, HubSpot, or using these tools like iPaaS, integration platform as a service, things like Zapier or Workato. So it's, the funny thing is, it's like when you've got these platforms and these integration services that make it easier to connect things, that actually helps inspire more people to create software because the integration used to be a barrier. As that barrier starts to get reduced, more things start to appear.
Well, this is what I was going to lead into, because you mentioned that every year people say, surely that's it, it's time to consolidate, but it keeps growing and growing as we've seen. Um, I guess I guess you've partly answered this already in the previous answer, but from the vendor standpoint, what room is there for innovation and differentiation, both for existing companies and as you previously alluded to, the new players in the market?
Yeah, well, I think there's always room for innovation. Sometimes it's very niche, right? Like someone is creating a solution for a very particular industry or a very particular region, and some of the dynamics of how people work in that region. And those solutions can be very good. The scale of how big they can get is very limited. And again, that's part of the story here is that not every company in martech is going to become like a multi-billion dollar success, that you actually have a bunch of these specialized tools that might be, yeah, a business making 5 million, 10 million, 20 million dollars, but within their niche they are actually a very good and well respected solution. But that being said, I think you also have innovation just because the environment in which marketing is operating is just constantly shifting. I mean, like one example would be, here with 2020, there was such a shift towards, from in-person trade shows and conferences to these virtual events. And so you had like one of these companies, like if you've heard of Hopin,
Yes.
Is a really, like, they didn't even exist that long ago, and they came up with a really cool way to help facilitate, online events. And then just last week, they like raised $125 million. So it's like every now and again, you find these like innovators who basically they're catching the right time with a new way of thinking about it. And yeah, it can very quickly rise.
Yeah, and that's always going to happen. Yeah, absolutely. Let's look at then at the marketer perspective. 8,000 vendors. You may look at that, and it's not so much a map anymore, I presume. But how can a marketer sort of get to grips with, I guess, almost limitless choice? What do they need to look for?
Yeah, it's so I actually recommend that people do not look at my marketing technology landscape. That is not the way to go about this. I think there's a couple just really simple strategies that marketers should take. First of all, is forget about the technology for a moment and just really focus on understanding what are you trying to do? Like, how are you trying to engage your customers? Where are the places you think there's a new opportunity, to reach a new audience? And just try and understand those use cases before you start looking for what technology will help you address them, rather than the other way around of, oh, hey, here's a tool. I wonder what I can do with it. And then I think the second thing is, we were talking earlier about integration. One of the benefits a lot of marketers have now is they've probably chosen a primary product for their marketing stack. It might be Salesforce, it might be Marketo, it might be HubSpot, whatever it is. But all those companies now have an ecosystem around them of apps that are designed to integrate very nicely with those platforms. And so one of the ways a marketer can simplify their lives is to say, okay, well, first, if I have a need, let me see if there's already an app that it integrates nicely with the product I already have. And that tends to be a much more narrow, constrained market. And then I think the third strategy is to recognize the fact that there's so many things out there. Looking for the perfect app is probably not a good use of your time. Again, if you're approaching this from a view of what are the use cases I'm trying to address, if you can find an app that does what you want, you like it, the economics of it are good, then an economist would call that satisficing. That you find something that does what you need and you go with it, and you don't worry about the fact that, hey, there might have been 10 other products out there that I could have looked at too. It's like, that doesn't matter. What matters is, are you able to use a set of tools to get the outcomes you want to drive?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose we can now sort of feed this into how the role of marketing is changing and what marketers have to do now. And I guess look at what COVID has done to impact that. I mean, generally in your experience overall, have you noticed an acceleration in digital marketing initiatives since the pandemic began? Companies perhaps realizing we are a little bit behind the 8 ball?
Yeah, I think that's been pretty consistent across, certainly martech, but even the broader, just sort of tech industry is, it's, first of all, it's just like now in 2020, when people become so dependent on these digital channels as a way to find and engage with their customers, they've just had to move a lot more quickly. But also, I even find it for some of the technologies that companies use internally, because so many have had to have their work, forces, work remotely, work from home. And so that's also provided some momentum for more of these distributed and decentralized ways of collaborating and leveraging these tools.
Yeah, and so I guess with that in mind, it could be worth, we can look now at the, what you spoke about at DeepCrawl about martech and web experiences of the very near future, to which I imagine some of this plays into. I mean, without giving too much away, what were these? What message did you generally get across to the attendees?
Yeah, so I looked at 5 trends that I see happening today that I think are actually going to just accelerate even further. One is this rise of what we call no-code tools, which very broadly, it isn't just about like no-code, like building an app, although there's tools for that. It's more of like empowering non-specialist business users to be able to have tools that let them do things, at least for the low-end cases, that previously they would have had to hire an expert or wait for an expert in IT to build for them. Or in many cases, like they just wouldn't do it at all because it just wasn't worth it, waiting for that, so I think you see this explosion of all these new tools that are really empowering people to self-service, more of their needs for like a workflow or a landing page or, some sort of like data analysis that they just want to understand. So there's that. Another thing we really leaned into was from that martech landscape, this idea of the great app explosion, the fact that, it's not just martech, it's like everywhere, every, segment of, the industry at this point, there's just this explosion of more and more software, certainly commercially packaged software, but also custom software, people who are leveraging, developers. There's like, 20 million developers in the world, and they are just on fire. They've been given all these superpowers from all of these, cloud platforms, and so the amount of software in the world is, it's expanding at a very rapid rate. We talked a little bit about the shift from big data to big ops, that a lot of what the past 10 years was about was just how do we manage the flow of all this data in our organization. We're starting to get our hands around that, but now we're sort of moving on to the next level of the problem, which is, okay, it's not just about collecting this data and keeping it in some data lake, that we occasionally, go to for insights. It's about all these apps and workflows and processes and automations and, machine learning algorithms that are now all running in parallel on this same data, and how we start to manage operating across all these different tools and making sure that they're well governed and synchronized, and that we're not getting misaligned, as multiple people are working with some of the same data. And then the last one we covered was just starting to look at how people are adapting to harnessing AI and machine learning in practice. There's a narrative out there that says, like, AI is going to remove the job of the marketer. And I don't think that's true. I think actually what you're seeing, and will likely see for quite some time, is that marketers are kind of creating a partnership with these more sophisticated tools, and they're finding a way to allocate their time and talent in a way that's actually much more productive with these tools than it's ever been. So that was kind of the narrative. We covered quite a bit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, looking at the AI side of things, is it a case that marketers can't, measure everything to the nearest detail and automate everything, or is it the fact that they shouldn't? The human element needs to remain perhaps in some form in that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's a mix. Part of it is when you actually look at what AI and machine learning is good at today, it's able to process, the scale of data in ways that's much better and faster than we can do as humans. But most of these technologies are focused on very narrow use cases, right? They, if you want to, look for, like if you want to use an AI to like go through and help you crop a set of photos automatically, because doing it by hand, would take you forever. You can use this AI tool. It can automatically identify, crop them perfectly for you, and it does it in a matter of, seconds. But the decision of, okay, what do I want to crop? And how do I want to use that in my storytelling? That's the sort of thing that the AI is not helping anyone with at this point, and so that's very much, the human insights into how we integrate, these different capabilities across our business, how we apply the empathy, certainly with our customers, but also with our own teams and our own partners, and like, the art of collaboration is a very human, dynamic at this point. So I think that's really where you're seeing this, balance of we're using these tools, but boy, there's so much need for, sort of the human dimension of this to really get the value.
Yeah, absolutely. And looking at, I guess, the big data to big ops trend that you mentioned, that seems, as much technological as it is cultural as well. So maybe a little bit, obviously, we've got to, I suppose, caveat this with COVID and thinking, well, the culture is completely changed now if everyone's working remotely. But I guess on a more holistic level, getting that culture to change in an organization to feel as though again, I guess more collaborative and more streamlined.
Yep. Yeah, I think it's the recognition that I just did a post on this on my Chief Martech blog recently, is this idea of ops. It used to be a pretty small, like there was the operations of the business, but most of the other aspects of business, like marketing and sales and customer success, you didn't really think about ops as being a significant portion of what those missions were about. But now, because we've got so many of these technologies that are being applied and so much data that we're trying to manage and so much automation and process that's being driven to it, is the importance of having these ops roles that really understand how to orchestrate, the capabilities in marketing or sales or customer success. Those are professions that are now like emerging and growing at incredible rates.
Mm. Absolutely. And you mentioned that there are, frameworks that you put together as well. I mean, is there a sort of specific example of one of these trends that you could share with how that's worked?
Sure. Yeah. No, I'm a framework person. It's the way I try and understand how all these things are working together. So like for instance, when we were talking about AI, you can imagine a 2x2 where on one hand you talk about things becoming less or more automated, and on the other axis you can think about things being less or more human. And so in that sort of 2x2, the lower left, where some things aren't very automated but they aren't very human either, to me that's like the sort of manual labor that, it's this rote activity where a human's going in there like, okay, I got to cut and paste this email and I'm cut and pasting this thing from this Excel spreadsheet over to this other system here. It's just not a good use of time. When we get more automated, that upper left part of the quadrant, it really is about this idea of, okay, how do we start to get this mechanical thing happening here, where instead of cutting and pasting, it can be like a rules-based automation. On the other axis, sort of like the lower right, where things still aren't automated, but they're becoming more human, I think there's a ton of meaningful things that happen there that we don't want to lose sight of. Like when a marketer is having a one-on-one conversation with a customer to like understand, what their pain points are, to understand, their desires, really being able to like craft, the story of like what's going to help solve, that customer's needs. That isn't automated, but boy, is that really valuable. We should do more of that. But then what gets really interesting is that top quadrant, the upper right, where things can be both automated and human. And like an example of that is using the AI technologies to like pay attention to like the vast digital touch points that we have with customers, and then to be able to identify patterns where like, okay, actually it looks like there's a customer who's having a problem here because there's some sort of desync with the expected pattern, and then in alerting a human being who can actually help intervene, hopefully solve that problem for that customer in the moment, but also understand like, okay, is this a problem we need to fix on a larger basis? And so that starts to become this magical place where we're leveraging AI and automation, but we're doing it largely to also help us find the right opportunities for us to bring our human talents to bear.
And I guess to what extent is that more the role of, say, the CMO or sort of head of marketing at a particular company, is their role, I guess, to champion these use cases as well as provide a practical way to improve their company?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is both what makes marketing exciting and also challenging today, is there are so many new capabilities that we can bring to bear, but it is still a lot of work to figure out like, okay, well, what's possible? And then given what's possible, what's going to be meaningful to our business? Where do we think we'll actually be able to get value from this? and then implementing these things, even if the technology exists and it's, out of the box, just buying the technology is very often the easiest part. The real challenge is how do we rethink our process and our strategy and the way our teams work to take advantage of that? And, even here in 2020, where everyone's had to change very rapidly, and it's actually been very impressive how quickly so many companies have adapted to these circumstances. That being said, change is hard. It's always been hard. It's still going to be hard, and I think that's one of the, most valuable things a CMO can do is really be that, guiding force to like keep the organization changing, but do it at the pace that, works for humans and, and doesn't lose our culture in the process.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you say change is hard, but I suppose in the 2020 context, change has been inevitable because
Yes, right. Yeah.
so I guess with that in mind, let's look towards 2021. I mean, hopefully we may get back to some sort of near normality. I suppose the question I want to ask you is, what have we learned in 2020 through this inevitable change that we can keep into 2021 in terms of best practice?
Yeah, I think there's two things. First of all, the unexpected happens. Like we are now in a world where for quite some time, technology change has been what we consider the source of disruption. And, from one business to another, it's actually been very challenging. But I think what we realized here in 2020 is like, okay, yes, there's technology changes that can be disruptive, but there can also be things like global pandemics. I mean, we all hope there isn't going to be another one for a long time, but we just don't know, And so this really, I think, has brought into perspective for people this idea of creating adaptability within their organizations, that those companies who were able to change more rapidly in response to the circumstances of COVID-19, fared better than those who, it just, they weren't ready. It just took a lot more time and effort for them to make these changes. So that's one thing I think. And then the other is, you're absolutely right that, in spite of the circumstances being, incredibly challenging, it is impressive how many companies were able to adapt so significantly and so quickly to these circumstances. And even if I think we all hope that we won't be under those same sorts of circumstances next year, but the recognition that, listen, if we have to change, we can change quickly. So even when we're in better circumstances, the expectations we should hold ourselves to of how quickly we adapt, to new technologies or new customer opportunities, we hopefully won't be as crazy as 2020, but hopefully it will also be a little bit faster than it would have been in 2019.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And finally, looking at marketers specifically, if they may be, unsure of their company's role in the world or even unsure of their role in the company, looking ahead to 2021, obviously we've mentioned uncertainty and hopefully a little bit more certainty and a little bit more speed next year. I mean, what advice would you generally give to marketers who may be a little concerned?
Yeah, well, I mean, the role of marketing as this champion of the customer, of understanding the customer's journey, of being able to serve it, that need is as important as ever. So the opportunity for marketers, I think, is very great. The important thing is to make sure that because the environment is changing in marketing, and it probably will continue to change for quite some time, you've just got to embrace the fact that you need to be continually learning. You need to have an open mind. You need to do some experimentation. And I think marketers who are willing to lean into that are going to be much more successful over the years ahead. And rest assured, everybody's going through it, right? I mean, you're not alone. Like, I understand that this is stressful. It's not easy, but you're not alone. Everyone's in the same boat. And so maybe that makes it a little bit easier to say, all right, well, this is the state of, modern marketing. Let's just embrace it.